Here at the Seattle Atheist Church, the members ourselves give many of the talks. We have a planning meeting every quarter, next Sunday to be a fact, that's open to the whole community where we consider suggestions for talks that members of our community would like to give. For today, please join me in welcoming Mark to give a talk about the silence meditation, promises and pitfalls. Please welcome Mark. Woo!
Thank you. And so, yes, so I want to start by thanking you for giving me the opportunity to talk today about the science of mindfulness meditation, because it's a topic that I really love. And also, I did learn quite a bit by preparing this talk. So a few things in my experience than to focus and clarify thoughts than to preparing a talk or teach a class. So I will talk about two specific topics today. So first, I'll discuss a few research approaches to study the effectiveness of mindfulness meditation and related practices, and focus on some of the challenges of doing scientific research into these practices. And second, I discuss a new framework that has been used or is being used now to introduce mindfulness meditation to a wide audience, and that's an evidence-based framework that recently has been devised at the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So why discuss these two topics? So one reason is that the scientific study of mindfulness meditation actually gives us a good example of how challenging it can be to study psychological interventions in a scientific way. And so what I want to do here is to review some important concepts and tools that will help you navigate the quite messy scientific literature on mindfulness meditation, and also help you see through the hype that you'll find. So both in some of the scientific literature, but pretty much uniformly so in the popular press. And I think that's a real challenge for the layperson. And so my other motivation is to share with you my enthusiasm for mindfulness meditation practices, as I've been meditating for a long time and have derived and still derive great benefit from it. So at first blush, these two statements may seem a bit paradoxical, but the bottom line is that I think that these practices are very useful, but that its scientific investigation still is in an early stage. And I hope that by the end of the talk, this will be clear. So let's dive in and start with the question, what actually is mindfulness meditation? And simply put, it's a technique that strengthens our ability to pay close attention to the nature of our experience with an attitude of curiosity and in a non-judgmental fashion. So paying close attention to the nature of our experience. So that's not something that we routinely do or something that has been favored by natural selection. But these practices allow us to expand our self-awareness and increase our self-knowledge. And I think it's fair to say that we humans tend to suffer from a profound lack of self-knowledge. And it's obvious that natural selection didn't favor that either. But it strongly impacts our individual well-being, and I would say that of society at large as well. Now, I want to underline that mindfulness meditation is not really a technique to silence thoughts, or what I call my inner pundit. It's more about changing the relationship that we have with our thoughts. And also don't see it as a relaxation technique, although meditation tends to be relaxing, and frankly, that's why a lot of us started to meditate. So as you probably know, mindfulness meditation has been practiced for millennia, most notably in Buddhist circles. And it's only recently, kind of starting in the 1980s and growing rapidly over the past 2 decades, that it has been investigated in a scientific way. Now, accumulated evidence from thousands of scientific studies indicates that mindfulness-based practices promote health and well-being. And this research has been carried out in a large variety of settings, including anxiety, depression, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, addiction, and others. Now, there's a large number, so there's a number of issues that with these scientific studies that I want to discuss now. So, and that's in addition to the general replication issues that have been noted for any medical, psychological, sociological, and biological studies that Mickey Phoenix discussed some 3 months ago. And so for me, the most important problem lies in the kind of control studies that are used. So let me briefly explain that. So researchers studying whether mindfulness meditation diminishes stress, for example, would measure stress levels at the onset of a study, and then again after, say, an 8-week training course. So most frequently, especially in the early days, this training course is the mindfulness-based stress reduction course, or short for MBSR. Now, in this course, the participants learn mindfulness meditation in addition to light yoga exercises in what is called a body scan, which also is used in yoga. And also at similar points, the researchers would assess stress levels in a control group that is not following the MBSR course. Now, very often, and pretty much uniquely so in the early days of the research, this control group is made up of people who are on a waiting list for this MBSR programs. And we call that a passive control. Now, an active control, on the other hand, would be a group where the participants follow a different program. For example, an MBSR program without the mindfulness component. Now, what a passive control misses, of course, besides the content of the course, is that the participants are not getting the support of a compassionate teacher. They're also missing out on the potential support of positive interactions with peers, allowing participants to realize, say, hey, I'm not the only one here in the room who struggles with this or that issue. So they're also not taking time off from work or other daily preoccupations to go to the class or to do daily meditation practice at home, which is an important part of the course. So altogether, these things can make a huge difference. And that's in addition to the more generic placebo effect. So now, the bottom line of many studies that had an active control is that the difference between the mindfulness intervention and this control study tends to disappear, which actually is not unexpected. So it doesn't mean that the mindfulness intervention doesn't have a positive effect, but rather that the effect was as large or similar size as that of the control intervention. And we can see that because some of the studies that have an active control also use a passive control. And you can see the difference between these active control and the passive control. Now, another challenge in sorting through the literature is that the active controls are typically not standardized. So it's different from one study to the other. Also, of course, it's different from pharmaceutical interventions. You just give a patient a sugar pill. But in this case of any psychological intervention, that is really much more complicated. And this is really the key of the problem. Now, the key issue that I have with these studies, and other critics have made this clear in the literature, is that to use these wait-listed, so studies that use these wait-listed control tend to claim that mindfulness is the key explanatory factor for the experienced benefit. And of course, the popular press gobbles this up, and so it's impossible to learn from what's really going on from reading the popular literature. Now, another caveat of most meditation studies is that the evaluations of the results are largely performed using self-reports, which means questionnaires that the participants fill out for mindfulness, stress, resilience, and so on. But the accuracy of these self-reports also has been called into question. So an improvement on this would be to use multimodal approaches, say, including these questionnaires, in addition to adding direct measurements of, say, in the case of stress, mindfulness-based stress reduction, stress hormones, which correlate with the with stress, of course, measuring activation state of the autonomic nervous system, which can be readily be done, brain scans, so all of which report on really on the direct state of your mind. And now a growing number of studies are using these approaches. And overall, which is a good thing, they tend to corroborate these self-reports. Now, ideally, the readouts of choice would actually include behavioral outcomes and tell you, how mindful is this person? So I'll give you one example. So there's a recent study, I think published a year or so ago, that looked at 2 training programs for caregivers of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So one was a standard training program, and the other one was mindfulness-based practices in addition to the standard program. So that's a really very good setup. And the readouts included self-reports of the caregivers and the behavioral response of the people they were caring for, such as how much aggressive behavior did they display, or how often did they need restraints or emergency medication and so on. Great study design. And so by both measures, so self-report and behavioral, they found that the mindfulness-based program was significantly more effective than the standard program. So that's really a very well-controlled study. And these kind of studies are difficult to generalize, but of course, very encouraging. So now another way to research the effectiveness of mindfulness meditation is to investigate what is called dispositional mindfulness. So dispositional mindfulness is our stable state of mindfulness. So it varies from one individual to the other, and meaning some people are inherently more mindful than others. Another term for dispositional mindfulness is called trait mindfulness, so distinguishing it from what is called state mindfulness, which is a momentary condition. For example, I tend to be more mindful in the morning than in the evening. So overall, many studies have shown an inverse correlation between dispositional mindfulness and depression, anxiety, stress, including post-traumatic stress disorder, eating disorders, for example. In other words, so people who are more mindful tend to be less depressed, report less stress, and so on. And there's also a significant positive association with dispositional mindfulness and psychological well-being. And so clearly, that's a completely independent way to look at the role of mindfulness in well-being. The assumption here being that you can actually increase dispositional mindfulness by training, by practicing mindfulness meditation. And the good news here is, yes, so scientific studies suggest that mindfulness meditation indeed enhances dispositional mindfulness. It's not surprising, but still it's important to establish that. So taken together, the results from the various approaches that I discussed thus far tell us that mindfulness meditation is beneficial. So to conclude the first part of my talk, so I want to mention one important recent development, and one that is actually has been accelerated by the ongoing COVID pandemic, and that's the implementation of digital mindfulness-based interventions. So there are now dozens, if not hundreds, of commercial mindfulness apps available, and lots of meditation centers, especially since the start of the pandemic, make recordings of talks and guided meditations available. So one advantage of this development over traditional face-to-face formats is the obviously enhanced accessibility. So the Headspace app, which you may have heard of, seems to have the largest market share, and I was really surprised to learn that it currently counts 70 million subscribers. It's a really huge expansion available here. So the use of such apps also allows for the standardization of mindfulness meditation as a therapeutic intervention, or the improvement of well-being. And so it can eliminate a number of confounders in scientific studies. Now, another important feature of these apps is that they can readily be personalized. So, for example, based on his research on addiction, Judson Brewer, a psychiatrist who also directs a neuroscience research lab at Brown University, he developed apps for smoking cessation. So specific apps, a different app for smoking cessation, one for eating disorders. And he also recently introduced one for working with anxiety conditions. Of course, meeting in person has important advantages, as it's, of course, more interactive, and also it allows for dialogue with teachers and peers. And to remedy this, for example, Judson Brewer, he sets up weekly live video check-ins to at least fill part of this gap. So this is a good segue to the concluding part of this talk, which is a very brief introduction to an app that puts mindfulness-based practices within a solid scientific context. And that's the Healthy Minds app. That's an offspring from the work of the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And this is led by Richie Davidson, a neuroscientist who has been working in this field for decades. So the app uses a framework that has 4 dimensions that are important for well-being, and those are awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. And I'll briefly discuss these in a moment. So each of these qualities on their own supports well-being, and there's scientific evidence for this. And my hunch is that these qualities also promote healthy societies. If only we would be able to find out. So in any case, so I, for one, would love to live in a society where all these qualities come to fruition on a large scale. Now, it's important to underline that each of these qualities is trainable. And again, there is scientific evidence for this. So it's like a skill that you can train, such as riding a bicycle. And so in remaining 5 minutes or so, I'll just elaborate a little bit on each of these 4 skills. It also tells a little bit more what mindfulness meditation is about. So the awareness module aims to train a heightened and flexible attentiveness to our environment and ourselves, so embedding to our experience, including body sensations, thoughts, emotions, and speech. So an important component of awareness that I want to highlight here is called meta-awareness. So that's the faculty that allows us to be aware of what we're paying attention to, which is the key skill in promoting mindfulness. So let me quote William James here, so one of the founders of modern psychology, as he famously said, "My experience is what I agree to attend to." My experience is what I agree to attend to. And then he went on to say, the faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. And so bringing back a wandering attention over and over again, this is exactly one component of the awareness training. So the very root of judgment, character, and will. So these are very strong statements, and they date back more than 130 years ago. In the meantime, obviously, both the amount of information at our disposal and concomitant pressures on our attention have been increasing exponentially. So training the distinct faculties of meta-awareness and stabilizing our attention is really critical for our well-being these days. So the connection component, the second component, is about a sense of care and kinship that promotes supportive relationships and caring interactions. So evolution endowed us with an innate sense of caring for our immediate relatives and close associates. And our challenge here, I think, is to paraphrase Einstein, is to widen our circle of compassion. even though it's obvious that this innate sense of caring for those who are close to us also can be obscured by negative emotions. The insight module, the third module, focuses on self-knowledge. So this model uses self-inquiry, intentional investigation of our beliefs, and other psychological processes. I suspect that some of these insights also overlap with some of the Stoics, some of what the Stoics have been saying. So, for example, as Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, my mind, what is it? What am I making of it? What am I using it for? And so finally, the model of purpose is about discerning personally meaningful goals and values that we can apply in daily life. And actually, there's two components to this. So one is to know what's important to us, what gives us meaning. It's not trivial. And the second component is purpose. So how do we take what's important to us and distill long-term goals out of this that we can commit to and that we're passionate about? So I want to note here that there's very strong scientific evidence for the role of purpose in our well-being. Just one example, there's a very recent study that shows that people in their 50s who had a low sense of purpose had more than twice the likelihood of dying within the next 5 years compared to people who reported a high sense of purpose. Those are stunning numbers to me. So these are the 4 skills that are trained in this Healthy Minds app. And also I want to point out that of course, most of these practices have been part of the curriculum of a variety of contemplative traditions, most notably various Buddhist traditions, but I guess they're also present in some of the writings of the Stoics as well. And you'll tell me you know much better than I do. So hoping that I didn't muddy the water more than I clarified it today. So let me conclude by reiterating my take-home message that mindfulness-related practices that I just talked about are powerful tools that can support our well-being. But as I mentioned earlier, the scientific investigation into these practices is still in its infancy. There are still some significant challenges to be overcome in these investigations. I think they're really worth the effort. So thank you for your attention.